that are a part of any strong body of God's people. And so there are lots of talents within this group. And each of us has at least one talent to make application of Matthew 25. Some of us are one talent people. Some of us may be 3 talent people. Some of us may be 5. Some of us may have more than that. But the point is, we each have something that we've been given that we excel at or are strong at, that we can do for the kingdom of God and for the benefit of this local church. And so then the passage here in 3 through 8, the question becomes, how can we use that in the right kind of way, applying these principles that we find here that they might have immediately applied to the use of miraculous spiritual gifts? And the answer is in exactly the same way that they're told to, with a recognition of the fact that the body is one body and yet made up of many different members, and not every member has the same function. And that's not only is it okay, it's actually good. If your body was a one-trick pony, so to speak, and it only had one thing it could do, there was only one part that really functioned well, I mean, how long are you going to last? We wouldn't have made it to this point. And so we have all these different parts of the body that function together for our well-being. I remember when we were in Kirkwood, there was a lady who was a diabetic, and she had some of the struggles with circulation that a lot of diabetics have, especially as the disease advances and the problems that go along with it. And eventually she lost both of her big toes. And you think, it's a big toe. But unless you know something about the body or have had the experience of losing a big toe, she went through months of therapy to learn how to walk without both of her big toes. Because even though you don't pay much attention to your big toe unless you stub it, or it hurts, or it's got some other kind of an ingrown nail or something, unless there's a problem with your big toe, you just it's a big toe. It's there. It's kind of ugly, most of them are. But if you were to pay attention during the day when you're walking, you might be a little more aware of how much your big toe does in keeping you steady. I mean, just with me pacing a little bit back and forth on the floor, I can feel my big toe adjusting to help keep my body weight where it needs to be, so that my center of gravity stays where I want it to be when I walk. Now, I don't think about that. My body just does it. But the big toe is pretty important. And yet, I mean, I don't really give my big toe that much extra attention. So there are parts of the body, most of us wouldn't want to be a big toe, but there are parts of the body that are like the big toe, parts of the church that are like the big toe. You don't pay a whole lot of attention to it. It doesn't really call for a lot of attention unless it has a problem. But it does a whole lot of things behind the scenes that are pretty important at keeping the body functioning and being able to move around in the way that it needs to. There are parts of the church that are just like that. You don't hear a lot from them unless there's something that's going on that causes them to be in distress of some sort. They just quietly go about doing their work, and yet it's extremely important work that unless we stop and just pay extra attention to it, we don't even notice. And that's sad in some ways, I guess, but that's the way the body is. There are lots of things in my body that I don't really give a lot of thought to on a day-to-day basis, from the standpoint of worrying about it. It just does its job. And I'm thankful that it does its job, because when it doesn't do its job and there are problems with that part, the distress that causes can be pretty extreme and severe. So the point is not to ignore each other. That's not the point. The point is that there are lots of things that go on that we don't see. Those talents are as essential as people that stand up in front of us and do the work that's here. In fact, there's some sense in which, because we're only together 4 hours a week, those things are more important. And we tend to focus on the parts of the body that we see, don't we? I mean, that's just, I don't know, I guess in some ways it's a natural thing. And I don't, again, I'm not just talking about the body as the church, I'm talking about our own physical bodies. There are parts of the body that we really pay attention to. Our face gets a lot of attention because everybody sees that. And so we worry about what our face, most of us worry about what our face looks like. Some people say, well, you don't seem like you worried too much about yours this morning. But I mean, we worry about parts that are seen. And so it's like, those natural kinds of thoughts, but all of these parts are essential and important. So use your talents in a way that recognizes that the body is this diverse group of functioning parts, all of which have importance, even if we don't constantly recognize that importance. Yes, sir.
And I think with the example of the body, it's important not to look at passages like this and passages in 1 Corinthians and think, oh, it's all determined what my limits are. I can only go so far. I'm set in just, I do this one thing. We've all seen stories of people who, after, perhaps losing function of some parts of their body, there's people who can paint with their big toe.
Yes.
So even though we may think that the quote natural application of a part of the body is its only function, it's very adaptable to when there's weakness in one area. We shouldn't make that an excuse that we don't step up and start taking on new roles.
That's absolutely right. And a good example, I mean, all of us have been amazed by stories like that of people who have taken what could be considered a disability and turned it into a superpower, so to speak. I mean, it's just pretty amazing what people have been able to adapt parts of their body to do when the part that would normally do that function is not there. And so Andrew's right. It's really important that we not use this as an excuse to limit us. Well, I'm just a big toe, or I'm just a one-talent person, and so this is all I can do. I mean, again, one of the other applications of the parable of the talents is what? What happens when you use the talents you've been given? You get more. And that's typically the case. What we find is that when we do and use or allow ourselves to be used, that we develop abilities that we didn't even know we had. And so we may not develop it to the extent that someone else does. We might develop it to beyond what they are able to do. But important for us to use those talents for the good of the body. And, again, to make the application Andrew did, if there are parts of the body that are weak or struggling, then I can't use the excuse that I'm over here, I'm just this part, I can't do that. People who are seeking to glorify God see needs in the body, and they find ways to help step up and fill those needs, whether they do it or whether they help to encourage someone else to do it. I mean, there are lots of different ways we can accomplish this task. But it's looking out for the benefit of the body, for the well-being of the body. It's not for my glory. It's not so I can get the attention. It's so that the body can function the way that it needs to. So using those gifts for the benefit of the body, it's one of the ways that we use it. I think there is also at least implied within this text, certainly found in other texts, the idea that we use the gifts to the glory of God. And there's some sense in which those two things go hand in hand. When we use it to the benefit of the body instead of our own benefit or our own glory, the end result is that it does bring glory to God. And so there are lots of things that are like that when we make I think sometimes we get focused on the idea of, oh, it's all about glorifying God, and that's true. Ultimately, it is. But again, if we kind of look at 1 John chapter 4, the way that we love God is by loving whom? Loving each other, loving other people. So there's some sense in which when we recognize the fact that these gifts or these talents are given to me for use in the body in ways that help the body and help the body to grow and help the body to be what it needs to be, that brings glory to God. And the point of me saying it that way is not that the serving the body is more important than glorifying God. The point is very much what John's point is in 1 John 4, is we want to stress the first and great commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, right? Well, we do that. But then we neglect commandment number 2, to love your neighbor as yourself. So what does John say? Yeah, that's exactly right. So you claim to have commandment 1 really strongly, but you don't keep command 2. So guess what? You're not keeping command 1. Because the way you love God is to love other people. And so my point in saying this is not to stress the importance of doing what you can for the body above glorifying God. It's a recognition of the fact that the reality is when we apply these principles in the here and now in serving the people who are around us, that is in many ways the way that we most greatly glorify the God that we're seeking to glorify. And so we can pay lip service to glorifying God all day long, and if we're not serving people who are around us, then we're really not glorifying God, at least not in the ways that He wants us to. So that it is an integral part of glorifying God to apply these passages. You know, we talked, interestingly enough, there are 2 verses in this text that talk about us being a living sacrifice and being transformed by the renewing of our mind. The rest of these verses, guess who they are primarily dealing with our relationship with? People. I mean, 3 through the rest of the chapter is all about relationships with people. And so it's not an accident. There's no accident here that he gives us a couple of verses saying, be a living sacrifice to God, wholly acceptable. This is your spiritual service. And then spends the rest of the time, and really we could go on into chapter 13 and, by the way, chapter 14. So those first 2 verses deal with this idea of being a living sacrifice to God. Then chapter 12, verse 3, all the way through the beginning, probably chapter 15, verse 5, is dealing with what our relationships with people look like. Because that's how you present yourself a living sacrifice to God, is by sacrificing yourself in service to the people who are around you. John?
I was just going to say, it is possible to do the opposite as well.
Yes.
To love others and not love God.
Absolutely.
Revelation 2, the church in Ephesus, they had done a lot of things, but then the Lord says they had left their first love.
Right.
So there's a danger that way as well, to swing so hard the other way that we become self-absorbed with each other. And then before you know it, it's all about service.
Yes.
But then worship is lacking.
Yes. I mean, there absolutely is that possibility. And the other thing is that where do we really understand love? And again, this is really clear in 1 John. Because we hear a lot of talk about God as love in the world that's around us. But the God that is love in their mind, what kind of love does He show? I mean, think about it. I mean, we don't have to make specific applications. You can be as general as you want to be, but what kind of love does He show? Is His love tough in the mind of the world around us? No, God's love's not tough. I mean, it's pretty much a love that just accepts you however you are, and you can do whatever you want and live however you want to, and everything's good and fine. So it's not really the kind of love the Bible teaches. And so again, we're not talking about love for love's sake or just a feel-good kind of love. True love does some difficult things. And that's the love that glorifies God, is a love that's willing to tell people the tough things, but it's done in as loving a way as we possibly can. We're not planning on walking up and hitting most people with a 2x4. We want to let them know gently that where they are. Kind of the Nathan approach, if you will, that Nathan took with David, is generally speaking the better approach. We're seeking to try to lead them. We're not trying to hurt their feelings. We're not trying to make them mad. We're not trying to let them know how right we've got things. We see where they are, and it pains us to see where that leads, and we want to help them get to a better place. And so we use those gifts in that kind of way. And so he specifically mentions all these different gifts that are here in verse 6 through verse 8. And obviously there were a lot more spiritual gifts. If you go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 12, there were others that were listed there that aren't listed here. There are others in other places that are not listed in either one of those places or either one of those passages. But the point is just to think about, I mean, if you are someone who has the gift of giving, then do so generously or with liberality. If you're one who has the gift of prophecy, then use it in proportion to the faith that you have. If you're one who has the gift of service, then serve. I mean, it's generally, my point is, it's generally not difficult to look at whatever the talent is and figure out how you're supposed to use it. If you're trying to use it to the glory of God, then you're using it with reference to other people and with reference to what God calls you to be and what God calls you to do. And so that's how we should seek to use those talents. We may use them in other ways. A person who is mechanically inclined may use that gift to be an auto mechanic or perform some other function in the workplace. But they can also use that same gift in serving the people that they worship with or helping their neighbor in some way. And so using that gift not only for your own benefit, or the benefit of your family, but using it for the benefit of other people who are around you is the way that we're called on to use the talents that we have. Anything else about 3 through 8? We could look at each individual word, but I don't really think there's necessarily a lot more to be gained by doing that. As I've said before, when we start talking about making it practical as some people would like to make it, we would have to basically go through every scenario that's possible. And frankly, not only do we not have that much time, I don't have that much intelligence. I can't figure out every scenario that's ever going to be faced by everybody that's ever sat in this building. So you take those principles and then seek to the best of your ability to make the application to do what these principles teach us to do. Okay, let's go on to verse 9 then. And there's some point in this text, and you'll have to decide where that is in your mind, because I think I've gone back and forth as to where I think it is in my mind. There's some point in this text in which we go from our relationships with each other to our relationships with those who are outside. And I think that's somewhat important because we can have a tendency to kind of get a mentality that it's just us, and there's an old story. I've put it in the bulletin before and heard it told a number of different times about the Lighthouse Society, and there were these people that got together to try to get the lighthouse back up and running and doing the things that the lighthouse ought to do, and so they restored it, and they met regularly to talk about ways to improve the lighthouse, and ultimately the only thing that they never did was get the lighthouse actually functioning to do the job that it was designed to do. And sometimes the point of the story is that sometimes that's like the church. We get so focused on making ourselves what we ought to be, and we're banding together. We are the body of Christ and all those kinds of things, and we forget that we're supposed to shine as lights in the community. And so we keep all of that here in the building, and we do all the things that we're supposed to do together, and we forget that we do all of those things that we're supposed to do together so that we can then take the gospel message to the world that's lost and dying that's outside. And so we need to not do that. We have responsibilities to each other, yes, and to use Galatians chapter 6, especially of the household of faith. There's some sense in which that should come first, just as the people of your household probably come before most anybody else. Our relationship with each other should be a high priority, but it should not keep us from doing what our responsibility is toward those who are outside. And most of us have to have some interaction and connection with people who are outside. So it's important for us to understand what that's supposed to look like too. So anyway, he starts in verse 9, and this may still be our relationship with each other. It may be that it's not a really clear line of distinction between inside and outside. It may be that it kind of transitions from one to the other kind of a little less rigidly. Let love be genuine. Abhor what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly affection. I'm pretty sure verse 10 is still talking about us. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not be slothful in zeal, but fervent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in tribulation. Be constant in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints. Well, that's pretty clear. And seek to show hospitality. So we're going to stop there. I'm not necessarily saying that's the end of the section talking about our relationships with each other. I'm not saying it hasn't already made a transition. But we'll look at verses 9 through 13. Jim, you got something, Jim? Or is it Audra?
I think that one of the things that seemed to be prevalent and when I was much younger was the idea that when you went to a gospel meeting or you went someplace, you felt like you were knitted with the other people that were there. I don't think that that's so much the case that we feel anymore. And maybe that's me. Maybe I'm the one with the problem. But it seems like that seemed to be something that was taught and was talked about and became ingrained in us. And I don't feel that that's so true anymore. I don't know if that's, like I said, whether it's me or what.
I don't think it's just you. I think that society as a whole, I mean, it's really interesting. Interesting might be the wrong word, that the closer we seem to live in proximity to one another, the less we know each other. I've told stories before. I mean, my grandparents grew up on farms in south central Kentucky. Their closest neighbor might have been a few miles away, and yet they knew everything about them. They knew all their kids. They knew when their kids' birthdays were. They knew when their anniversary was. They knew all those things. Now we live sometimes 16 feet from our closest neighbor, and we have no idea who they are. And unfortunately, not only does that tend to be the case in our neighborhoods, it becomes it has become, in many cases, not always, but in many cases has become the norm even in churches. I think that mentality of being in close proximity and yet having no idea who they are has just, I mean, it's the way that it is in everything that affects society. It has a tendency to leach into the church if we're not careful. There are some of these things that we have to just actively push against and work against. And if we're not pushing against it, then ultimately we're letting some of those ideals leak into our churches as well. And so I don't think it's just you. I mean, we're supposed to feel like when we go to a gospel meeting that we're going to be with extended family, right? And that's what we're doing. I mean, if I go, no matter where it is, I mean, and you know, Lakeview is a little different for most of us because most of us have either really close friends or family members who are over there. And so that feels a little more like extended family. We go beyond that to, you know, I mean, even perhaps just Southport or Greenwood, we're not as familiar with those people. We don't know them as well. And so we may be a little less inclined to feel that way when we go there. But again, those are things that, I mean, what else has changed? I mean, just to Audra's point, when gospel meetings used to be in the area, what was it that most of us would try to do? You attend them. It's interesting how if you go around to all these churches and attend their gospel meetings, you feel a little closer to them, right? Because then you know some of the people who are worshiping there. And so again, as life has changed, if we're not pushing against the grain, then we have a tendency to let some of those things leach in. And so it's important for us to nurture the practices that led to the feelings that existed in those times before. And if we're not continuing the practices, then it should be no surprise to us that we don't have the feelings. If I didn't spend much time with my wife, I probably wouldn't feel very close to her. So the action of spending time with her leads to the natural feeling of being close to her. I mean, I could live in the same house with her, but if we are not actively pursuing a relationship with each other, then I may be right next to her and not feel close at all. So we have to actively do the things that are going to lead to the inclination and feeling of what existed before. Jim.
I'm not sure where we're at.
I'm not either. 5620 25th Street.
Just a couple of observations. I grew up a city boy.
Yes, me too.
As opposed to my wife. And houses, when I was a kid, houses had porches on the front
Yes.
of the house. And it was not uncommon at all to, in the evening, people would go for a walk. And I can remember gazillion times of people stopping and talking to my parents,
Right.
who were sitting on our front porch. And we knew not just the kids in the next door neighbor. I mean, I knew families 3-4 blocks away.
Sure.
And we knew, when a baseball game was going to pull up together, or shooting basketball, or whatever.
Right.
That's one thing. One of the things that in the verse here, where it says that let love be without hypocrisy. I used to work with a gentleman who's recently passed, but one of the things that he seemed to pride himself on knowing everybody's name.
Yes.
And he was he'd walk erect, and he'd keep his weight. I mean, just everything, all the external things about him were presentable. But he would walk around and if he'd come up and you'd walk past him, he wouldn't say, "Hi, Brace." He'd say, "Hi, Brace," and it didn't matter. But you didn't, after a while, you got to know him, but you didn't know whether or not he was making an expression in your direction for the sake of acknowledging you, or was he doing it for show?
Right.
Just say, I won't say his name, but I mean, it was something that all the people that he knew, what a lot of people didn't know is that the guy who really knew everybody's name was a man that worked for this fellow. And so he would say, "Oh, who's that guy? What's his wife's name?
They would tell him.
Hey, Joe, how's Dorothy? Anyway, but like say, remember the old commercial? Is it real or is it Memorex?
Right.
Of course, there's probably not too many.
Yeah.
even though they didn't know like. So what's a Memorex? Anyway, that's.
Well, so let love be genuine without hypocrisy, or let love be genuine, or as you said, I guess the New American Standard says, let love be without hypocrisy. Obviously the same ideas. So Jim gave one example of how love could be hypocritical, or what appears to be love could be hypocritical. What are some other ways that love could be hypocritical? I think it's important to think about that a little bit. Jim, yes, sir.
I had a comment concerning this Romans 12. This is a Christian's manual of personal conduct in the spiritual and the human family. And
Yes.
so you're talking about our responsibility to the outsiders. Another way to say that is we don't want to become so heavenly minded that we're no earthly benefit.
Right, absolutely. That's exactly true. Oh, Greg's got something. I didn't either. Oh, man, it really is 9:45.
I guess as we move forward in Romans 12, I feel like there's nothing wrong with sort of waxing nostalgic about love, but verse 9 begins with telling us to love one another.
Right.
And then the next several verses are actually defining that term for us.
Yes.
And really, none of these have anything to do with our feeling towards one another.
No.
Not a one of these
Nope.
things. And love cannot be without emotion, but
Right.
that's not what biblical love is.
Right.
So as we discuss what this means going forward, it's not how I feel towards my wife. It's how I treat her that determines whether I love her or not.